The Widow's Heavy Veil. London, 1898. A doctor sits at his mahogany desk, writing for the Dietetic and Hygienic Gazette. His pen scratches across paper as he forms these chilling words. Many a woman has been laid in her coffin by the wearing of crape. He's not being dramatic, he's stating medical fact. The elegant black mourning veils that Victorian widows wore for years, they contained arsenic, chromium, benzene. Every breath filled their lungs with poison. Every tear that fell made it worse. This is how grief became a death sentence. Before we dive into this dark Victorian secret, get comfortable wherever you are. Dim the lights, settle in. If this story helps you unwind tonight, consider subscribing to Hearts and History for more bedtime tales from the past. And leave a comment, where are you listening from? What time is it there? I love knowing where these stories travel. Tonight, we're walking through foggy Victorian London, where mourning became a deadly ritual. Close your eyes. Let's step back to 1898, when doctors were discovering something horrifying about widows' weeds. Picture Victorian London. Gas lamps flicker through yellow fog. Carriages rattle over cobblestones. And everywhere you look, women in black. Not just any black. Deep, matte black that seems to swallow light. These are widows, wrapped head to toe in mourning crape. Their faces completely hidden behind thick veils that trail to their feet. Society demanded this performance of grief. But what society didn't know, what the widows themselves didn't realize, was that every thread of that beautiful black fabric was saturated with poison, literal poison, and they were breathing it. Victorian mourning wasn't just wearing black to a funeral. It was theatre. Elaborate, expensive, suffocating theatre. When your husband died, you entered deep mourning. 1 year and 1 day of complete social isolation. No parties, no theatres, no weddings. You were considered unlucky, cursed. Your presence would doom a marriage. And what you wore was prescribed down to the smallest detail. Everything black, everything matte. No shine, no reflection, because vanity was forbidden. Grief was supposed to hurt. It was supposed to be uncomfortable. They just didn't know it was supposed to kill you. The veil itself. God, the veil. Not some delicate lace thing. We're talking about 2 layers of heavy crape, thick as canvas, stiffened with glue and starch, 6 feet long, weighing several pounds. It covered your entire face, came down to your feet, trailed behind you like a shroud. Women described feeling like they carried a literal load of grief on their heads. But that weight, that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what the fabric was made of, what it was dyed with, what it was treated with. Pure toxicity. Here's where it gets insane. To create that perfect dead black colour, that matte finish that wouldn't reflect light, manufacturers used arsenic. Yes, that arsenic, the famous poison. They also used chromium, benzene, copper chloride. The fabric was essentially soaked in toxins, then dried, then shaped into veils that covered women's faces for hours every day. Every breath pulled arsenic particles into their lungs. The stiff fabric rubbed against their skin, causing chemical burns. When it got wet from tears or rain, the dye would stain their faces black, and the only way to remove it, more poison. Dr. Prince Morrow documented case after case in the 1890s. Women coming to him with mysterious face rashes, respiratory problems, chronic headaches, dizziness, nausea. Some went blind from the particles getting in their eyes. Others developed permanent lung damage. One medical journal called Mourning Veils veritable instruments of torture. Fashion magazines wrote that the eyes that survive the bitterness of tears succumb to the poisonous rasping of crape. But did society change the rules? Did they make mourning safer? Not even close. The social pressure was too strong, the industry too profitable. Working class widows had it worse. They couldn't afford custom mourning clothes, so they'd dye their everyday dresses black, using the cheapest chemicals available. often even more toxic than the expensive stuff. And they couldn't afford to stay home for a year of mourning. They had to work in factories as servants, wearing their poisonous clothes in hot, poorly ventilated spaces all day long, breathing in those particles constantly, getting sicker and sicker. But a widow who didn't follow the mourning rules, she'd be shunned, gossiped about, judged as insufficiently devoted to her dead husband. The mourning industry became massively profitable. Courtauds dominated crape manufacturing worldwide. Entire stores, Jackson's Mourning Warehouse, Jay's Mourning Warehouse, specialized in widow's weeds. Department stores added mourning sections. Fashion magazines advertised the latest in grief wear. It was this huge, thriving business built on social pressure and human suffering. They were literally selling poison to grieving women and calling it respectability. And the worst part? One person's influence made all of this so much worse. But we'll save that story for later. For now, just imagine those women slowly dying beneath their veils of propriety. By the 1890s, doctors were finally speaking up. Medical journals published desperate warnings about crape poisoning. Many a woman has been laid in her coffin by the wearing of crape, that doctor wrote. Not metaphorically, literally. The fabric that was supposed to honor the dead was creating more dead. But change came slowly, too slowly. Social expectations don't shift overnight, even when they're killing people. The toxic veil remained the symbol of proper grief, no matter how many women it sickened. Tomorrow night, we'll explore how deep this poisonous tradition ran, and who made it so much worse. A time of mourning. Picture this: London, 1870. Your husband dies on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, society has already decided how you'll spend the next 2.5 years of your life. Where you can go, who you can see, what you can wear, even how you can grieve. Victorian mourning wasn't just about loss, it was about performance. A carefully choreographed dance of sorrow that every widow had to master perfectly. One wrong step, one moment of joy showing through, and you'd be branded as heartless, unworthy, a woman who didn't truly love her husband. The rules hit you immediately. Deep mourning, 1 year and 1 day, minimum. No exceptions. Everything black. Everything matte. No shine, no shimmer, nothing that might suggest you still cared about looking attractive. Your world shrinks to the size of a coffin. Church on Sundays maybe, close family, if you're lucky. But parties, weddings, theatre, forget it. You're poison now. Bad luck walking. People literally crossed the street to avoid a woman in widow's weeds. They believed your presence could curse their happiness, make their marriages fail. The clothes themselves were torture devices disguised as fashion. Heavy black crepe that weighed several pounds, stiff as cardboard, scratchy against your skin. The smell, God, the smell, like chemicals and death mixed together. Your mourning veil had to cover your entire face. 2 thick layers of this poisonous fabric hanging down to your feet. Try walking in that. Try breathing. Try functioning when you can barely see where you're going. Summer was the worst. Women fainted constantly from heat stroke, their faces hidden behind suffocating black curtains. The isolation was designed to break you. You couldn't work well if you were wealthy. Working class widows had to choose between eating and following the rules. You couldn't socialize, couldn't laugh in public, couldn't show any sign that life might still be worth living. Friends stopped visiting after a few months. Who wants to sit with someone who looks like a walking funeral? Your own family got uncomfortable. Isn't it time to move on? They'd whisper. But moving on meant admitting you didn't love him enough. Society made sure you knew that. Every morning started with the same suffocating ritual: lacing yourself into black corsets, pinning on layers of heavy fabric, adjusting that horrible veil until your reflection disappeared behind mourning crape, then stepping into a world that treated you like a ghost. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones. Children stared and pointed. Even your own mirror became an enemy, this black-draped stranger looking back at you. Some days you forgot what your actual face looked like underneath all that fabric. You became grief incarnate. Nothing else. Nobody else. The judgment was constant. Relentless. Wear your veil wrong? Gossip. Smile at a shopkeeper? Scandal. God forbid you forgot and wore something with even a hint of colour. The mourning police were everywhere. Other women mostly, watching, whispering, reporting back. Did you see Mrs. Henderson at market yesterday? That grey ribbon on her bonnet was completely inappropriate. Only 4 months into mourning and already showing her true colours. Your reputation, your social standing, your future, everything depended on performing grief correctly, publicly, perfectly. After 1 year and 1 day, if you survived that long, you graduated to second mourning. 9 more months of black, but now you could lift that suffocating veil off your face. Pin it back, breathe actual air for the first time in a year. You could wear jet jewellery, black stones carved from compressed coal, or hair jewellery made from your dead husband's locks. Morbid? Absolutely. But it was progress in the twisted logic of Victorian grief. Half mourning came next. Grey, lavender, purple. Colours so dull they might as well still be black. Poor widows had it worse. Rich women could afford quality crape, servants to help them dress, homes where they could hide from judgment. Working class widows dyed their only dress black with whatever cheap chemicals they could find, usually more toxic than expensive dyes. Then they wore those poisoned clothes to factories, to other people's kitchens, scrubbing floors while breathing arsenic and chromium. No choice, no luxury of proper mourning periods. Grief was a privilege they couldn't afford, but society demanded it anyway, dying slowly while trying to survive. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine being told your pain has a schedule, your love has specific rules, your grief must be performed exactly right, or it doesn't count. Women who broke under the pressure were labelled hysterical, unnatural, sent to asylums for failing to mourn properly. Others just disappeared, retreated so far into black fabric and social isolation that they never found their way back out, became professional widows, professional mourners, living monuments to dead husbands they sometimes barely remembered anymore, beneath all that enforced sorrow. Here's what Victorian society didn't tell you about their beautiful mourning traditions. They were killing people, literally. Those elegant black veils were soaked in arsenic, chromium, benzene. Every breath filled your lungs with poison. Every tear stained your face with toxic dye. Doctors knew, fashion magazines knew. The companies making millions off grief definitely knew. But the pressure to conform was stronger than the will to survive. Which brings us to what happens when women finally start fighting back, when the cost of proper mourning becomes too high to bear. Toxic threads of sorrow. Picture a Victorian textile factory in 1885. Workers dip bolt after bolt of silk into vats of bubbling black dye. The smell is overwhelming, metallic, chemical, wrong. They're creating mourning crape, and they know it's dangerous. The dye contains arsenic, chromium, potassium dichromate, substances that could kill you if ingested. But here's the thing, this fabric will be wrapped around women's faces. They'll breathe through it, day after day, month after month, the workers making it wear gloves and masks. The widows wearing it, they had no idea what they were breathing. The process was intricate, almost ritualistic. First they'd take fine silk gauze and crimp it with heated rollers, creating that distinctive crinkled texture. Then came the dyeing multiple baths in chemical solutions to achieve that perfect light-absorbing black. After dyeing, they'd stiffen the fabric with gum, starch, sometimes glue. This gave mourning crape its peculiar stiffness and that odd, unpleasant smell widows complained about. The final step, adding more chemicals as preservatives. Every stage of production made the fabric more toxic, more dangerous to wear. Early Victorian mourning veils were actually safer. In the 1830s and 1840s, manufacturers used plant-based dyes, Valonia from oak trees, logwood from Central America, iron salts for depth. These weren't exactly harmless. Logwood could cause problems, but they were nothing compared to what came later. As demand exploded and Queen Victoria's 40-year mourning became the gold standard, manufacturers needed cheaper, faster ways to produce that perfect black. Enter the chemical age, and with it, a level of toxicity that would have horrified those early dye makers. Arsenic, the king of poisons, and it was everywhere in Victorian mourning veils. Not just traces, significant amounts. Manufacturers used arsenic-based compounds because they created the most intense, long-lasting black dye available. Arsenic trioxide for brightness, arsenic sulfide for depth. They'd saturate the fabric with it, then add more in the sizing process to keep the crepe stiff. The result? A veil that was essentially a delivery system for one of history's most notorious toxins. And widows wore it pressed against their faces, breathing through it for hours every day. But arsenic wasn't working alone. Victorian chemists threw everything toxic at mourning crape. Chromium compounds for that dull, non-reflective finish. Benzene for consistency. Copper chloride for preservation. Mercury salts in cheaper versions. Lead in the cheaper dyes working-class widows could afford. Each chemical served a purpose, and each one was slowly poisoning the women wearing them. The fabric manufacturers knew these substances were dangerous. They just didn't care. Grief was profitable, and Victorian society demanded its widows suffer, even if that suffering was literally killing them. The physical effects started almost immediately. That heavy crepe would rub against itself as women moved, creating friction. This friction released tiny particles of arsenic and chromium into the air around their faces. With every breath, widows were inhaling poison. Their eyes would burn and water, not from grief, but from chemical irritation. Many developed chronic headaches within weeks, dizziness, nausea, confusion. Doctors at the time called it nervous exhaustion from mourning. They had no idea they were looking at systematic chemical poisoning on a massive scale. The respiratory damage was devastating. Women who faithfully wore their mourning veils developed what doctors called consumption, chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, chest pain. But this wasn't tuberculosis. This was their lungs trying to cope with months of inhaling toxic particles. Some developed chronic bronchitis that lasted years after their mourning ended. Others suffered permanent lung damage. The thick crepe made it hard to breathe normally, even without the poison. Add arsenic and chromium to every breath. It's amazing any of them survived their required mourning periods. When the veil got wet, and it would, from rain or sweat or tears, the toxic dyes would leach onto the women's skin. Black stains that burned, acid that caused painful rashes across their faces and necks. The staining was so common that etiquette books included recipes for removal. Their solution? Oxalic acid mixed with cream of tartar. More poison to remove the poison. Women were literally dissolving their skin, trying to clean off the toxic dye, and if they didn't remove it quickly, some stains became permanent. Black marks on their faces that labelled them as mourners forever. The manufacturers knew, they absolutely knew their product was dangerous. Internal company documents from Courtaulds, the world's largest crepe manufacturer, show they understood the health risks. They required their factory workers to wear protective equipment. They provided masks and gloves to people handling the toxic dyes, but they never warned the women buying their products. Never printed health warnings on mourning veils. Why would they? Business was booming. Victorian society demanded these toxic shrouds, and Courtaulds was happy to supply them. Profit over poison, always. Think about the scale of this. Millions of Victorian women wore mourning veils, each one saturated with arsenic, chromium, and God knows what else, each one wrapped around their faces for months or years. Some women wore mourning for decades. Queen Victoria modelled 40 years of toxic veil wearing. How many women died from their mourning clothes? We'll never know. Doctors didn't connect the symptoms to the fabric. Death certificates listed consumption, bronchitis, nervous exhaustion, never arsenic poisoning, never chromium toxicity. The Victorian mourning industry literally got away with murder and called it fashion. The widow's silent suffering. Mary Phillips adjusts her crape veil for the 100th time today. It's been 8 months since her husband died, and the heavy black fabric feels like it's suffocating her. She has a splitting headache again. Her face burns where the coarse material rubs against her skin. She's dizzy, nauseous, and can barely catch her breath walking up the stairs. What Mary doesn't know is that her mourning veil is slowly poisoning her. With every breath, she's inhaling arsenic particles. Imagine carrying several pounds of toxic fabric wrapped around your head for 18 hours a day. That's what Victorian widows endured. The 2 layers of heavy crape weren't just uncomfortable, they were genuinely dangerous. Women described feeling like they were drowning in their own grief. The stiff material didn't breathe at all. In summer heat, they'd faint regularly, but fainting was almost preferable to what the fabric was actually doing to their bodies. Think about it, poison dust floating in the air right in front of your mouth. The arsenic-laden fabric would rub against itself as women moved, releasing tiny particles into the air. Every breath pulled those particles straight into their lungs. Dr. Prince Morrow described seeing widows with chronic respiratory problems that mysteriously appeared after months of wearing crape veils. They'd develop persistent coughs, shortness of breath, chest pain. Some women couldn't climb stairs without gasping for air. Others developed what we'd now recognize as chemical pneumonia, and they had no idea their mourning clothes were the culprit. The skin damage was horrific. The coarse crape would scrape against delicate facial skin, creating tiny abrasions. Then the toxic dye would seep into those wounds. Women developed painful rashes, eczema, and acne-like eruptions across their faces. Some scars lasted for years. When the veil got wet from rain or tears, the poisonous dye would leak directly onto their skin, leaving black stains that were nearly impossible to remove. Imagine trying to wash poison off your face with more poison. That was their reality. Eye problems were common and devastating. The thick double layer of crape made it hard to see clearly, causing women to strain their vision constantly. Worse, the arsenic and chromium particles would get into their eyes, causing infections, chronic irritation, and sometimes permanent damage. Fashion magazines noted that the eyes that survived the bitterness of tears succumbed to the poisonous rasping of crape. Some Victorian widows went partially or completely blind from wearing mourning veils. Their devotion literally cost them their sight. Here's what breaks my heart about this. These women were trying to honour their dead husbands. Wearing the veil was how they showed the world they'd truly loved. But society had turned their love into a form of slow suicide. Every day they woke up feeling sicker than the day before. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, confusion, all symptoms of arsenic poisoning. They were literally dying to prove their devotion. The very act meant to show respect for life was destroying their own lives, breath by poisonous breath. Working-class widows faced even worse suffering. They couldn't afford custom crape veils, so they'd dye their everyday clothes black using cheap industrial dyes loaded with even more toxic chemicals. Then they had to wear these poisonous garments to work in factories, bakeries, or as servants. Hot, poorly ventilated workplaces made everything worse. They'd spend 12-hour shifts breathing in concentrated poison while doing physical labour. Many collapsed at work. Some never got back up. Their poverty made their mourning literally deadlier. The psychological toll was crushing. These women were already devastated by grief, and now they were sick all the time. They felt weak, confused, constantly unwell. Many thought they were dying of broken hearts. In a way they were right, just not how they imagined. The mourning veil became a prison of suffering. They couldn't function properly, couldn't think clearly, couldn't care for their children effectively. Grief was hard enough without adding chemical poisoning to the mix. Society had made mourning a form of torture. What makes this tragedy even worse is that most women never connected their symptoms to the veil. When they developed respiratory problems 6 months into mourning, doctors diagnosed consumption or bronchitis. When they got mysterious rashes, it was blamed on nerves or hysteria. When they felt dizzy and confused, people said grief was making them fragile. The veil was just what widows wore. It never occurred to them that their symbol of devotion was the thing making them sick. How could something so socially acceptable be dangerous? By the late 1880s, something started to shift. A few observant doctors began noticing patterns. Women who wore mourning veils were getting sick in very specific ways. The symptoms were too consistent to ignore. Medical journals began publishing quiet warnings about the health risks of crape fabric, but the social pressure to wear these toxic veils remained overwhelming. Most widows still felt they had no choice. The question wasn't whether the veils were dangerous anymore, it was whether anyone would actually do something about it. The Widow of Windsor, an exception or a rule. December 14th, 1861, Windsor Castle. Prince Albert collapses in his study, burning with typhoid fever. Queen Victoria holds his hand as he dies at 42. She writes in her diary that night, "Why may the earth not swallow me up?" This moment changes everything, not just for Victoria, but for every widow in the British Empire and beyond. Because what happens next isn't just personal grief. It's a masterclass in how one woman's sorrow can trap an entire generation. Victoria doesn't just mourn Albert. She performs mourning like it's a religious ritual. His rooms at Windsor, untouched. Hot water brought to his dressing room every morning like he's still alive. His pillow arrangement never changed. She wears widow's weeds every single day for the next 40 years. Not months, not a few years. 4 decades of black crape. The imperial state crown sits in a vault because wearing it would mean removing her mourning veil. And everyone's watching. Here's where it gets complicated. Victoria declares the royal household will wear black for a full year, the longest mourning period in modern times, she says. But she keeps going, year after year. The press starts calling her the Widow of Windsor. That image, a queen draped in eternal black, becomes how the world sees her. And here's the thing about queens. When they do something, it stops being personal. It becomes the standard everyone else has to live up to. Picture this. You're a middle-class widow in 1865. Your husband died 2 years ago. You've done your time in deep mourning, then second mourning, then half mourning. You're ready to wear something, anything, that isn't black. But the Queen? Still in widow's weeds 4 years later. Still including Albert's bust in family portraits. Still using black-bordered writing paper. How do you explain to your neighbours that you're over it, when the Queen clearly isn't? This is where Victoria's grief becomes everyone else's prison. Because she's not just any widow, she's the Queen Empress. Her mourning habits get reported in newspapers across the empire. Fashion magazines write about her mourning jewellery, her crape arrangements, her sombre routines. What starts as one woman's devastating loss becomes the gold standard for proper widowhood. And that standard? It's completely impossible for ordinary women to meet. But they're going to try anyway. Think about the resources Victoria had. Custom crape made with the finest materials, servants to help her dress in those heavy veils, the luxury of retreating to Balmoral or Windsor for months at a time. She could afford to mourn professionally, if you will. Working class widows, they're trying to match her standard while working in factories, raising children alone, managing households. Wearing toxic black veils, they dyed themselves with whatever chemicals they could afford. The Queen's grief, their slow poisoning. By the 1870s, Victoria's been mourning for a decade. People start whispering. The Times gently suggests she might consider appearing in public more often. Parliament gets nervous about an invisible monarch. But Victoria doubles down. She commissions new mourning jewellery made from Albert's hair. She orders his statue placed in every royal residence. She makes grief her identity, and British society follows her lead, extending mourning periods, making the rituals more elaborate, more expensive, more toxic. Here's what's wild. Victoria genuinely believes she's honouring Albert's memory. This isn't performance or manipulation. It's real grief that never ends. But her personal sorrow becomes a social mandate. Etiquette manuals start recommending longer mourning periods. If Her Majesty finds comfort in extended mourning, they write. What they don't mention, Victoria has the best doctors, the safest materials, the financial security to grieve however she wants. Other women don't have those luxuries. The tragedy isn't Victoria's grief. Losing your life partner at 42, that's devastating. The tragedy is how her very visible, very public mourning creates impossible expectations for women who can barely afford basic mourning clothes, let alone 40 years of them. Victoria can retreat from society. Other widows still need to work, raise families, function in the world while wearing poisonous veils that make them sick. Her exception becomes their rule. Victoria's 40-year mourning period ends only with her death in 1901. By then, she's shaped 3 generations of mourning customs, made eternal grief seem not just acceptable, but admirable, set a standard that thousands of women tried desperately to meet, poisoning themselves in the process. She was the exception, a queen with unlimited resources and no obligations except to her own sorrow. But her example became the rule that trapped ordinary widows in deadly black veils for decades. When grief becomes an industry, here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize Victorian mourning. Someone was getting very, very rich off all that suffering. While widows were slowly poisoning themselves with toxic crape veils, a handful of companies were building empires. Think about it. Millions of women, required by society to buy expensive black fabric, wear it for years, replace it when it wore out. Grief had become the most reliable market in the world, and these companies knew exactly how to exploit it. Courtauld started as just another British textile company in the 1820s, but they saw something others missed. Death was consistent, mourning was mandatory, and crape was complicated to manufacture, which meant fewer competitors. By the 1870s, they'd cornered the market. They mechanized the entire production process, churning out thousands of yards of poisonous black fabric daily. Their profits? Astronomical. Their concern for the women wearing their products? Basically non-existent. Business was business, even if business was literally killing people. How do you monopolize grief? Easy. Make the manufacturing process so specialized that no one else can compete. Courtaulds patented their machinery, controlled the supply chains for raw materials, and undercut any competitors until they went bankrupt. They didn't just make crape, they made it impossible for anyone else to make quality crape affordably. By 1880, if you needed mourning clothes anywhere in the British Empire, you were probably buying from Courtaulds. They had turned human sorrow into their personal cash machine, but Britain wasn't enough. Courtaulds looked overseas and saw gold mines of grief everywhere. America? Perfect. They loved copying British fashion trends. France? Even better. The French took mourning seriously, sometimes more seriously than the British. Germany, Australia, Canada, everywhere Europeans had colonized, they'd brought Victorian mourning customs, and that meant demand for British crape. Courtaulds built an international shipping network, exporting toxic fabric to grieving women worldwide. Globalization at its most predatory. The numbers are staggering. At its peak, the mourning industry was worth millions in 1880s money. Entire streets in London were dedicated to mourning warehouses. Jays, Haywards, Marshall, and Snellgrove, they competed to see who could sell the most elaborate widow's weeds. Meanwhile, medical journals were publishing warnings about crape poisoning. Did the industry care? Did they reformulate their dyes? Did they warn customers? No. They advertised harder. They created more elaborate designs. They turned women's legal obligation to mourn into a fashion show. And then Queen Victoria became their greatest marketing tool, without even trying. When she wore widow's weeds for 40 years straight, she created the most powerful advertising campaign in history. Every woman in the empire looked to her as the standard for proper grief. If Victoria was still mourning after a decade, how could ordinary widows move on after 2 years? The companies didn't have to say anything. They just pointed to the Queen, draped in their crape, and let social pressure do the selling. Here's the most damning part. They knew. Company records from the 1890s show Courtaulds received complaints about skin rashes, breathing problems, and eye irritation from their crape. Did they investigate? Did they change their manufacturing process? No. They hired better lawyers. When doctors published studies linking crape to health problems, the industry fought back with their own research claiming the fabric was perfectly safe. They chose profits over people's lives every single time. By the 1890s, sales started dropping. Women were finally questioning why they needed to poison themselves to prove their love. Courtaulds panicked. They slashed prices, created lighter weight crape that was just as toxic, and launched desperate marketing campaigns. But it was too late. The medical evidence was overwhelming. Fashion magazines were telling women to choose safer alternatives. Between 1883 and 1894, Courtaulds' mourning crape sales dropped 62%. The grief gravy train was finally ending. This is capitalism at its most predatory. A handful of companies built fortunes by turning women's grief into a commodity, knowing their products were harmful, fighting every attempt at reform. They didn't create mourning customs, but they sure as hell profited from them. And when science proved their products were dangerous, they chose money over morality. But social attitudes were shifting. Women were starting to fight back. And that's where our story takes a fascinating turn. A shift in the winds. By 1888, something was changing in London's medical circles. Dr. George Phillips sits in his Harley Street office, reviewing case files. Widow after widow, same symptoms. Respiratory distress, skin irritations, chronic headaches, all wearing mourning veils. He's not the only one noticing. Across the city, physicians are connecting dots that Victorian society refuses to see. The pattern is undeniable now. These women aren't just grieving, they're being poisoned by their grief uniforms. And finally, doctors are getting angry enough to speak up. Dr. Morrow's practice in Manhattan tells the same story. 3 widows this week alone, all with the same angry red rash spreading across their cheeks. The crape has been rubbing against their skin for months, depositing toxic particles with every movement. He's started keeping detailed notes. Symptoms, duration of mourning, type of veil fabric. The evidence is mounting, case by case. He knows what's causing this. The question is whether anyone will listen when he tries to publish his findings. The Northwestern Lancet breaks the silence first. October 1889. The article is blunt. Mourning veils are a veritable instrument of torture. Not flowery medical language, just truth. The editor describes examining widow after widow with damaged respiratory tracts, chemical burns, chronic poisoning symptoms. He calls for immediate reform of mourning customs. The article spreads through medical circles like wildfire. Finally, someone with authority has said what doctors have been whispering privately for years. The mourning industry fights back immediately. Dr. Sarah McKinney becomes the first woman physician to document the specific dangers facing female mourners. Her 1890 study follows 23 widows, through their mourning periods. The results are horrifying. 15 develop chronic respiratory issues. 8 suffer permanent skin damage. 3 require hospitalization, all from wearing regulation mourning veils. Her detailed case studies provide the scientific ammunition reformers need, but publishing as a female doctor means fighting twice as hard to be heard. The New York Medical Journal joins the battle in 1892. Their investigation reveals the specific toxins, arsenic levels in mourning, crape test at dangerous concentrations. Chromium, benzene, copper compounds, all absorbed directly through facial skin or inhaled as particles. The journal publishes photographs of skin damage, chemical burns, respiratory tissue scarring, visual proof that mourning customs are literally killing women. The images are shocking enough to finally get public attention. Fashion magazines begin taking notice. Medical conferences in 1893 feature unprecedented sessions on mourning-related injuries. Dr. Williams from Edinburgh presents slides showing lung tissue from a 40-year-old widow, black particles embedded throughout. She'd worn her veil religiously for 2 years before dying of respiratory failure. The room goes silent. These aren't abstract statistics anymore. They're looking at physical evidence of how social customs are destroying human bodies. The medical establishment can no longer ignore this crisis. The marketing tactics were ruthless. Companies advertised in women's magazines next to recipes and household tips, normalizing the idea that elaborate mourning was just part of being a good woman. They created ready-made mourning outfits so widows could shop their grief immediately. They offered payment plans because they knew most women couldn't afford complete mourning wardrobes up front. They preyed on vulnerability, selling expensive fabric to women who were emotionally devastated and socially pressured. Pure exploitation disguised as respectability. By 1894, medical consensus is forming. The British Medical Association formally recommends against traditional mourning veils. The American Medical Association follows suit 6 months later. Professional medical journals across Europe publish similar warnings. Insurance companies begin noting patterns of mourning-related claims. The evidence is overwhelming, but entrenched social customs don't change easily. Mourning etiquette manuals still insist on full crape veils. The battle between medicine and tradition is just beginning. Then something remarkable happens. Forward-thinking fashion magazines begin featuring articles about hygienic mourning. Harper's Bazaar publishes a piece recommending lighter veils, shorter mourning periods, fabrics that don't shed toxic particles. Godey's Ladies' Book suggests alternatives to heavy crepe. These aren't radical publications. They're mainstream women's magazines acknowledging medical reality. The conversation is shifting from how to mourn properly to how to mourn safely. Change is coming. Young widows start quietly rebelling. Mrs. Catherine Wells, widowed at 28, publicly refuses to wear traditional mourning after her doctor warns about health risks. She faces social criticism but stands firm. Other women begin following her example. Support groups form. Doctors start recommending specific patients avoid mourning veils for medical reasons. Society is developing new language around grief, language that prioritizes the living widow's well-being over rigid tradition. Hope is growing. The tide is turning. Medical evidence has reached critical mass. Fashion is adapting. Women are speaking up. The mourning industry's profits are dropping as demand for toxic crepe plummets. What seemed impossible just 5 years ago, reforming centuries-old mourning customs, now feels inevitable. The question isn't whether change will come, it's how quickly society can adapt to protect grieving women. The next chapter of this story will show us exactly how that transformation unfolds. The mourning veil, a fade to grey. By 1890, the medical warnings couldn't be ignored anymore. The British Medical Journal, the New York Medical Record, the Lancet, all screaming the same message: these veils are killing women. And slowly, very slowly, society started listening, not because they suddenly cared about women's health, But because even Victorian propriety couldn't survive when respectable ladies were collapsing in church from arsenic poisoning, the change didn't happen overnight. But the cracks were starting to show in Mourning's deadly armour. Courtaulds felt it first. Their sales figures tell the whole story. 1883, peak profits from Mourning crape. 1894, down 62%. 62%. That's not just a bad year, that's an empire crumbling. Factory workers laid off. Warehouses full of toxic black fabric nobody wanted any more. The company that built its fortune on grief was watching that fortune evaporate. They knew something the rest of the world was just figuring out. The age of poisonous mourning was ending. Fashion magazines started changing their tune around 1885. Subtle at first, Harper's Bazaar suggesting that perhaps a lighter veil might be appropriate for summer wear. The Lady's Book recommending tulle instead of crape for second mourning. These weren't revolutionary statements, just tiny cracks in the wall of tradition. But for women who'd been suffocating under toxic fabric for months, these suggestions felt like someone had thrown them a lifeline. Permission to breathe again. Emily Post herself started backtracking. The woman who'd written the Bible on mourning etiquette quietly began suggesting alternatives. Maybe the veil could be pinned back more often. Maybe lighter fabrics weren't disrespectful. Maybe, and this was radical, comfort could coexist with grief. Other etiquette writers followed her lead, not boldly, not with fanfare, but with careful diplomatic language that gave grieving women permission to choose health over tradition. Small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Dr. Prince Morrow wasn't subtle anymore. 1894, writing in his dermatology textbook, he flat out called mourning veils dangerous. Other doctors joined in, articles in medical journals, letters to newspapers, conferences discussing the epidemic of widow's rash and respiratory disease. They had data now, proof, pattern after pattern of women getting sick from their grief clothes. The medical establishment was finally willing to say what everyone suspected. Mourning customs were literally killing people. Some women started resisting, quietly at first. A shorter veil here, a lighter fabric there. Nothing too obvious, couldn't risk the gossip. But word spread through networks of widows, whispered conversations in church, shared letters between sisters, ways to mourn that wouldn't poison you. It took courage. Imagine choosing your health over social approval when society valued your suffering more than your survival. But these women had buried enough people. They weren't about to join them. The shift wasn't universal. Rural areas held on to strict mourning longer. Working class women still couldn't afford safer alternatives. And plenty of society matrons still insisted on traditional crape, proving their devotion through their willingness to suffer. But in cities, among educated women with access to medical information, change was happening. Slowly, carefully, with guilty relief, like prisoners who'd served their sentence, discovering the cell door had been unlocked all along. Then came World War I, the final blow to Victorian mourning. Millions of men dead, women working in factories, no time for elaborate grief performances, no money for expensive crape, no patience for customs that kept women weak when the country needed them strong. Mourning veils caught in machinery, toxic fabric incompatible with war work. Practicality finally defeated propriety. When survival was at stake, society chose life over tradition. Courtaulds pivoted desperately. 1904, they bought patents for artificial silk production. Rayon, they called it. No more relying on grief for profits. The mourning warehouses closed or converted to regular fashion. Jay's mourning warehouse in London became just Jay's. The infrastructure of death dissolved into memory. An entire industry that had fed on sorrow finally starved. Not because people stopped dying, but because they stopped believing suffering was the only way to show love. By 1920, it was over. The age of toxic mourning veils ended not with celebration, but with quiet relief. Women could grieve without poisoning themselves. But here's what keeps me awake. This victory came decades too late. How many women died wearing those veils? How many suffered in silence, thinking their pain was just grief when it was actually arsenic? We'll never know the real count. The relief feels hollow when you remember all the women who never lived to see it. The final toll. The unseen victims. Here's what the history books miss about Victorian mourning. While wealthy widows retreated to their estates with custom-made crape veils, working-class women had no such luxury. They couldn't afford special mourning clothes. They had to dye their everyday dresses black using whatever cheap chemicals they could find. These dyes were often more toxic than expensive ones. And here's the brutal part. They couldn't stay home to grieve. Bills don't stop because your husband dies. Picture Sarah, a factory worker in Manchester, 1887. Her husband dies in an industrial accident. She has 3 children to feed. The next morning she's back at the textile mill, wearing a hastily dyed black dress, the fabric still reeking of poisonous dye. The mill is hot, poorly ventilated. She's breathing toxic particles all day while operating dangerous machinery. Her wealthy counterpart is resting at her country home, attended by servants. Same mourning rules, completely different realities. The cheap dyes working-class women used were terrifying. Lamp black mixed with toxic binders, aniline dyes that hadn't been properly tested. Sometimes they'd use ink, soot, even coal tar to achieve that required deep black colour. These makeshift dyes were more poisonous than commercial crape dyes, more likely to cause skin reactions, more likely to release toxic fumes. But when you're choosing between mourning properly and feeding your children, there's no choice at all. Working women faced constant judgment about their mourning clothes. Too thin? Not devoted enough? Too cheap looking? Disrespectful. But they couldn't afford quality crape that cost more than they earned in months. Society demanded the same performance of grief from everyone while providing vastly different resources to achieve it. A rich widow's year of mourning was supported by inheritance and social networks. A poor widow's mourning was unsupported survival while wearing poison. The health consequences hit working-class women hardest. They couldn't afford doctors when the rashes appeared. They couldn't rest when the toxic dyes made them dizzy or nauseous. They worked through respiratory problems caused by their mourning veils, because missing work meant eviction. Meanwhile, wealthy widows had access to private physicians who could identify and treat crape poisoning. Class didn't just determine the quality of mourning clothes, it determined who survived wearing them. Domestic servants faced a particularly cruel situation. They had to maintain their employer's mourning standards while wearing their own toxic mourning clothes. A lady's maid might spend her days handling her mistress's expensive, properly made crape while wearing her own cheap, more dangerous version. She'd be exposed to double the toxic load, quality poisons from above, deadly makeshift dyes from her own grief. The irony was lost on no one. Factory work in mourning clothes was a nightmare. Heavy crape veils caught in machinery. Women were injured, some killed, because their mourning veils got tangled in gears or pulleys. But removing the veil meant social disgrace. Some factories eventually banned veils for safety, creating an impossible choice: follow mourning customs and risk death, or work safely and face community judgment. Working-class widows were trapped between physical danger and social expectations. Children of working-class widows suffered too. They watched their mothers slowly poison themselves with toxic mourning clothes, while struggling to provide basic necessities. These children often went to work themselves to support the family, sometimes as young as 8 or 9 years old. The mourning industry that profited from wealthy widows was built on the backs of working families who couldn't afford to participate safely in the grief culture society demanded. When medical warnings about toxic veils finally emerged in the 1890s, wealthy women could afford alternatives: lighter fabrics, better made veils, shorter mourning periods. Working class women couldn't. They kept wearing the same dangerous, cheap mourning clothes because they had no other options. The health crisis that ultimately ended Victorian mourning culture was solved first for the wealthy. Poor widows continued poisoning themselves years after safer alternatives became available to those who could afford them. The final toll wasn't just individual suffering, it was systematic inequality disguised as shared tradition. Victorian mourning culture claimed to honour universal grief, but it punished the poor for grieving with inferior, dangerous materials while protecting the wealthy with quality alternatives. The true victims weren't just the women who died from toxic veils, they were the working families who had to choose between mourning properly and surviving safely. Class determined everything, even the right to grieve without dying. The morning after, a new dawn. Here we are, end of the journey. You've walked through decades of grief turned into performance, love twisted into poison, sorrow made into a social prison. Heavy stuff, right? But here's what strikes me as I think about all this. Those Victorian widows, breathing in arsenic through their veils, they weren't different from us. They loved just as deeply. They hurt just as much. The only difference, we learned to grieve without killing ourselves in the process. Think about how we mourn today. No rulebook dictating exactly 365 days of black crape. No social committee measuring the depth of your sorrow by the weight of your veil. When someone you love dies now, you might wear their favourite colour to the funeral instead of black. You might plant a garden, get a tattoo, write letters you never send. You might grieve for 2 years or 20, and nobody hands you a poisonous costume and calls it love. The shift didn't happen overnight. It took 2 world wars, millions of deaths, and finally, doctors brave enough to say what everyone suspected. That beautiful black crape was beautiful death. The fashion industry fought it. Court halls didn't want to lose their monopoly on manufactured grief. But women themselves started walking away, quietly at first, then in waves. They chose breathing over tradition, living over performance, and honestly, good for them. Modern mourning is messier, more honest. We don't have a uniform anymore. Some people need to talk constantly about the person they lost. Others go silent for months. Some find comfort in rituals. Others in breaking every rule their family ever had about death. We've learnt that grief is as individual as fingerprints. What helps one person heal might destroy another. And that's actually beautiful in its own chaotic way. You know what we gained when we lost those rigid mourning rules? Permission to grieve authentically. No more performing sorrow for an audience. No more proving your love by how much you're willing to suffer. A widow today can laugh at a funny memory without being judged as heartless. She can date again without being called disrespectful. She can choose her own timeline, her own rituals, her own way back to whatever life looks like now. The Victorian widows taught us something important. Though not in the way they intended, they showed us what happens when society decides there's only one right way to feel. When we make grief into a competition, love into a performance, sorrow into a social requirement, their suffering wasn't meaningless if we learnt from it. If we chose empathy over judgment, support over surveillance, healing over harm, maybe that's their real legacy. We're kinder now, I think. When someone's grieving, we don't hand them a schedule and a costume. We ask what they need. Space, company, someone to listen, someone to help with practical things. We've learnt that grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow rules. It shows up at weird times, in unexpected ways, and instead of judging that, we've learnt to just be with people in it. That's progress. Imagine showing a Victorian widow our world, a place where therapists help people process grief instead of just endure it, where support groups exist for every kind of loss, where you can take bereavement leave from work, not for appearances, but for actual healing. Where wearing bright colours to a funeral isn't scandalous, it might even be requested. She'd probably think we were doing it all wrong. Or maybe she'd be jealous. Picture a woman today, maybe someone listening right now. She's lost someone she loves. And yes, she's broken, but she's not wearing poison. She's not performing her pain for strangers. She's grieving in her own time, her own way. Maybe she's wearing his old sweater instead of black crape. Maybe she's laughing through tears at something he would have found funny. Maybe she's healing, and nobody is judging her for it. So that's where we leave this story. With that image of freedom, a woman free to grieve as she chooses, to heal as she needs, to love and lose and find her way back to life without society demanding she poison herself to prove her devotion. It took us a while to get here, but we made it. Sweet dreams, and remember, however you grieve, however you heal, you're doing it right.